Hey Hope Church, wanted to bring you another midweek devotional. We've been looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and considering our difficulties and our suffering. And really, as Paul points out here, the communal nature of that suffering. He was sharing with the Corinthians both his suffering and his comfort. And he talks about, as we looked at last time, the suffering that he shared with Christ. But I wanted you to think about something as we continue on in this passage. He says in 2 Corinthians 1 verse 8, "For we did not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction that we experienced in Asia." And it's just a little sentence, but it does point us to something that I want you to think about in the middle of your suffering. Many of us, when we suffer, we want to suffer alone. We're kind of like that animal that wants to go off and hide and not let anybody know of our suffering. And in fact, we probably go and do that, and then we not only feel sorry for ourselves, but we get angry or frustrated with other people because they're not aware or they're not caring for us in the middle of our suffering. And yet what Paul is saying to the Corinthians here is that he wanted to share with them his suffering. He wanted them to be aware of what he was going through. It just points to the fact that this community is to be ministering to one another in the middle of their suffering. And so to do that, you have to communicate. You can't just be quiet and expect somebody to know about your suffering. Paul wasn't doing that. He was saying to them, let me tell you about what's going on. And he's actually going to tell them how difficult and how hard it was. And he's going to tell them what they were feeling and what was endangering them to their soul. I want to just talk to this for just a second because I think some of us have been trained either from our backgrounds or our culture or our pride to not share those sufferings. We want to look good, we want to sound good, we want to be spiritual, and I suffer from this just as much as anybody. I hesitate to share my difficulties and my sufferings because of what it might do or how it might affect my reputation or how it might endanger what I have to do. But Paul is saying here, he's not really concerned about that. He's concerned about them understanding his suffering so that in his comfort, they would receive comfort. If you go and you hide, then there's no way for that communal nature of suffering to take place. Now that doesn't mean that there isn't an appropriate time, an appropriate place, or group of people to share that suffering with. Sometimes people get caught in the idea that everything that happens, everything that's bad, they need to put out on Facebook or they need to communicate to somebody. And maybe sometimes that's okay because people are verbal processors, but the truth is we don't have to share everything. But if we share nothing, then that communal nature of our suffering is lost. And God's made us to be part of one another. And so I want to encourage you, if you are in the middle of suffering, if you are in a place that is difficult, that if there are things with which others can come around and maybe they can't do anything, but maybe they can just pray. Maybe they can just enter in. Maybe they can just speak a word to you of encouragement. Be one to open your mouth. Don't let your pride, don't let your background keep you silent. Make others aware and don't suffer in silence and alone. Paul didn't suffer in silence and alone, and I think he's calling us to be people that are in the body of Christ, loving one another, caring for one another, suffering together. And so consider opening your mouth and sharing with somebody else your suffering, and you just might receive the comfort that they have received in their own suffering. Another devotional thought for you to think about this week.